In this episode, I am speaking with Russ Eanes, who's been on the podcast pre-pandemic. Russ has pivoted from religious publishing to being an author, walker, bicyclist, guide, travel educator, and a few other things I can't remember right now. The point is, Russ continues to adapt and takes advantage of opportunities as they arise. Cue the music.
Welcome to the Repurpose Your Career podcast, brought to you by Career Pivot. This podcast is where those of us in the second half of life come together to discuss how to repurpose our careers for the 21st century. Come listen to career experts give you proven strategies. Listen to people like you tell their stories on how they repurpose their careers. And finally, get your questions answered. Your host, Mark Miller, has made 6 career pivots over the last 30 years. He understands this is not about jumping out of the frying pan into a fire, but rather to create a plan where you make clear, actionable steps or pivots to a better future career. Are you ready to repurpose your career?
Welcome to episode 322 of the Repurpose Your Career podcast. My name is Mark Miller, and I'll be your host every Monday for discussion on what it's like to repurpose your career. In this episode, I'm speaking with Russ Eanes, who's been on the podcast pre-pandemic. Russ has pivoted from religious publishing to being an author, walker, bicyclist, guide, travel educator, and a few other things I can't remember right now. The point is, Russ continues to adapt and takes advantage of opportunities as they arise. Russ is a writer, walker, and cyclist from Harrisonburg, Virginia, a freelance publishing consultant and travel coach and guide. His goal is to inspire others to more meaningful, peaceful, and less consumptive lives. He is also an avid traveler with a love of culture, cuisine, and history, especially of Europe and Latin America. Russ is a former member and successful graduate from the Career Pivot community. I first interviewed Russ in episode 143 after he published his book, The Walk of a Lifetime, 500 Miles on the Camino de Santiago. I later published an updated episode in February 2021 about how Russ was adapting to the pandemic. Russ continued to make adaptations throughout the next couple of years, including spending 1 year working full-time for Get Set Up as a travel instructor. Russ recently published his latest book, Pilgrim Path to Assisi, 300 miles on the way to St. Francis. We discussed in this episode how he got to where he is today and that he's not done yet. Russ's story was highlighted in an article in the New York Times by my friend and colleague, Mark Miller. No, we are not related, called How a Solo Gig Can Give You a Stronger Retirement. I recommended Russ to Mark for this article. This episode is sponsored by the Career Pivot community, but more on that later. Without delay, let's get to my discussion with Russ Eanes. Welcome to the Repurpose Your Career podcast. I have the real joy of having a former community member and what I consider a good friend, Russ Eanes, on the podcast. And Russ is going to talk about his journey. Where he's ended up is not where he planned. So, Russ, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Mark. Glad to be here.
So, Russ, what did you do in the first half of life?
Yeah, I did a lot of things. And what I mostly describe are the last couple things I did in the decade or more before I made my big shift after age 60. I worked as a book publisher, and I worked for the Mennonite Church as a pastor, but mostly as a book publisher, eventually running their book publishing agency, their curriculum agency. And I liked it in many ways. I was well suited for it. But because both church institutions and publishing companies have been on hard times and declining for decades, I was kind of at the nexus of a perfect storm. And I found a lot of my work ended up being downsizing and adapting to downsizing. And there's a point where I just said, okay, this isn't how I wanted to find my life.
You left your job, and what did you do?
I took a year off. I knew I needed it. My wife and I were in a place financially where we could afford for me to do it. I wasn't planning on taking the rest of my life off, but just 1 year. I figured during that year I would sort out what I wanted to do next. And meanwhile, I had some adventures that I'd been planning that I thought might help me sort that out. And one of those was to walk the Camino de Santiago in Spain. And I'd been wanting to do this for decades, and I really wanted to take like 6 weeks to do it, not like do it in little bites, but really be gone, check out of my ordinary life for 6 weeks. And I did it, and it turned out to be life-changing in many ways. The walk itself was invigorating. The orientation it gave me to life was invigorating. But also, I discovered that as part of my processing what I was going through after walking it, I wanted to write a book. And I was my kind of dream gig that I would have after I left my publishing job was to help authors self-publish. And so I thought, well, if I'm going to do that, I better self-publish book myself. I've, published as a professional in the industry through a business, but I've never done it as an individual. So I'll apply the knowledge I have, I'll self-publish a book, and then I can coach other people. Turned out the process of writing was so much fun. I'd always wanted to write that I said, when I got the book out, I said, this is just fabulous. I'm going to do another one.
You got your book published. Was it successful?
It's been very successful. Most self-published books never sell 1,000 copies. I'm working on 6,000 copies in about 3.5 years. And it's led me to a bunch of other things, lots of good connections, including, I've written a second book. So that just came out 2 weeks ago, and other ideas for more books. And before the pandemic hit, I just really enjoy the contact with readers. I mean, it does provide a nice little income stream if you do it right. And I've also developed kind of a methodology for helping authors sort out what they want, what their outcomes are, because a lot of people are very vague. So I use my experience in self-publishing to develop a methodology to help other people both write and self-publish a book, if that's what they want to do, and meet their own expectations, to figure out their realistic expectations so that they can meet them.
Now, your book came out before the pandemic. Then the pandemic hit. How did you adapt?
Yeah, I had actually was in the process of an on-site, in-person book tour. I was lining up places I was going to speak about my book. I had done a couple of about 3 appearances in the winter in early 2020. And I had several more planned for the spring, and every one leverages the next appearance. And then the pandemic hit and everything shut down. All my appearances were canceled. And for any of us who were self-publishing using Amazon, we didn't know, but Amazon prioritized shipping things like paper towels and rubber gloves over books. And what I did was, I was fairly early on in this. I switched my events online, and there was a learning curve. And one thing I learned through being in Career Pivot was getting the right equipment. Technical equipment makes a huge difference. And those events became successful, and book sales picked back up. Contacts for my other work picked up, my consulting work. And that led eventually actually to working for a company called Get Set Up, and then a full-time job with them, which I took during the pandemic because I reckoned that my next job, the next book I was going to write was going to involve travel, and I couldn't travel anywhere.
So how did you learn about Get Set Up?
Yeah. So one of the great things about being involved in Career Pivot is you get to meet other people, and you connect from one person to the next. And Deb Livingston, who was in Career Pivot, became a friend, and she went to work for Get Set Up and started telling a bunch of us about it. And it turned out they were teaching online classes. And Deb said, well, you've figured out how to do online events. I think you could make a pretty easy transition to this. And I did. And again, started out part-time with them, then became full-time.
Yeah. One of the key things we're going to try and weave through this is all about relationships. And
exactly.
you've developed a number of relationships, including with me, with the other Mark Miller, with Deb, and all of that kind of comes together. My congratulations to you. You kind of let it happen.
I did, and I've been always I've always believed that relationships are really important and that you should never toss them. Sometimes we have more time for some than others, but always maintain the important ones. And this kind of post-career network I've developed has been invaluable. And by the way, I've been given opportunities through it. I also look for opportunities to help some of my connections. And it's free. I mean, I try to give away everything I can for free to help others who are maybe in the situation I am in or have been in. That's key, to look out for each other. And so starting with Career Pivot, meeting you, Mark, I met the other Mark, I met Deb. Through Deb, met others. So I started working for Get Set Up. My last book editor came through someone who came to my classes at Get Set Up. So the network keeps spreading, getting wider.
Yeah. And by the way, I'll put a link in the show notes. I had Deb Livingston on the podcast about a year and a half ago, and she was running their cooking group at Get Set Up. And I've had the Neil D'Souza, the CEO of Get Set Up, on the podcast. So you worked for Get Set Up. I remember you talking about when you took the job, there was a factor around your wife. Tell us about that.
So my wife gave me that year off. She continued to work part-time. And so I said, hey, I've now got a full-time job. Now, why don't you do what I did? And you leave your job, which you're tired of or just time to move on from, and explore what you want to do. And she had been interested for quite a while in becoming a birth doula. And she'd actually gone through the training pre-pandemic. She got her qualified licensing pre-pandemic. And then when the pandemic came, they shut down the opportunities for our doulas to work in hospitals because they were allowing like one person with a mother in delivery. So she still took her year off. And then as those restrictions lifted, she started getting back into that work and she's been really successful at it. She manages as many births per month as she wants, which is about one birth per month, maybe two sometimes. So it really, I helped her then be able to go out and explore what she wanted to do. And as a couple, we're really happy for how that worked for us.
You went to work for Get Set Up. How long did you work? And then what came after that?
Yes. So I work with them. I'm still with them now after 2.5 years, but I worked about 13, 14 months full time. And I realized that I was ready to get back into writing, and I wanted to go back and write my second book, which is the one that just came out, and that I was going to need to travel to Italy to do it. And I was going to need 3 weeks, and just wasn't going to work in my work with them, my job. So I asked to cut back to part-time. It turned out within a few months, all of the full-time guides, that's what we were called, were let go anyway. So I preemptively let myself go from that. And I've still stayed part-time teaching with them, just a few classes a week, and partly keeps my skill going. And I'm also looking at developing that kind of thing on my own.
So what's the next book?
It is called Pilgrim Paths to Assisi, 300 miles on the way of St. Francis. It's in some ways a companion to my first book. It explores partly what it's like to walk in Italy, walking through the Apennines. It's a more challenging route. It is physically challenging. It's also more remote. There's fewer people on it, but you get to experience Italian history, Italian culture, Italian food, beautiful Italian scenery. And then I continue to explore some themes that have developed in my life, and then I want to reflect on as I'm older. I think those of us in our 60s ought to now be in the wisdom stage where we can begin to synthesize different things happening in our life and in history and around us, and walking is a great way to reflect on those.
Who did you go walking with?
Well, I went walking with my wife, most of it. We started in 2019 in September. So right after my first book came out, we went for our first walk there, 2 weeks. We loved it. We were going to go back in May of 2020 to finish it. And if China was the epicenter of the pandemic in the spring of 2020, the second epicenter, of the pandemic was Italy. And I wasn't going to go back there. Nobody was going there. And that took 2 years for things to fully reopen. So finally, last spring, we went back for 3 weeks. We walked together, the most challenging portion of it. At that point, the two of us had walked over 3/4 of the route between Rome and Florence. And I thought that just for the heck of it, to make sure I'd walk the whole thing to be able to write my book, I went back last September by myself and actually started walking from St. Peter's Square in Rome, which is generally the pilgrimage destination where people end up. I started there and walked again toward Assisi. And what I thought would be a kind of a solo walk with a lot of solitude and quiet ended up being a partnership walk. I met a guy, people referred to him as my doppelganger. He was same age, gray beard, hiker. We were waiting out a rainstorm in front of a grocery store. I always greet other pilgrims, people walking on the way. His name was Ed. He was from Holland. He had excellent English. And we ended up then just walking together for the next 4 days. Just made a new friend and was, so I really have walked very little of it by myself.
This episode is sponsored by the Career Pivot membership community. The Career Pivot membership community is a group of people from all over the U.S. and Canada with diverse backgrounds. This is a community where everyone is there to help everyone else out figure out what they want to do in the second half of life and then make it happen. Many have made changes that they did not know existed or was possible when they came to the community. They learned from each other and broadened their horizons on what was really possible. Let's hear what Greg said about being part of the community.
I joined the community when I was in the midst of a career transition. And what I needed unbiased input and support and observations from folks who'd present me with their point of view that would help me figure out what I'd like to do next. And I didn't want to do it with people who lived around me or past professional colleagues. So that's where Mark and the community have been really instrumental. So I've got a built-in support network who will be genuine, honest, and supportive.
You can't just join the community. I bring people into the community every few months in groups. You can sign up for the waiting list, so when I open the door for new members, you'll be notified. If you're interested in learning more about the endeavor and sign up for the waiting list, please go to careerpivot.com/community. Now, back to the episode. Well, again, it comes down to relationships.
Right.
Right? And I'm sure walking with him helped you process what you were going through.
Well, it did. And it gave me someone else's eyes to see what I'm seeing, to take note of things. I learned some stuff from Ed. He likes history and geography. So he would explain things to me that I hadn't thought about or hadn't noticed, and vice versa. I helped him with some things, and it just turned out to be. And we'll probably at some point maybe we'll go walking with Ed again. I've loved the opportunities on these pilgrimages to meet people from around the world, and I've got a dozen or 24 friends that sometime if a bunch of us decide we want to go hiking or biking somewhere together, we can do it.
The book. Is it out yet?
The book is out, yes. And I'm just kind of in the middle of all my launch events. I've done some again on Facebook Live. I'm doing podcast interviews and I'm doing live events. I've got 2 live events still this month. And I'm hoping to do more live events. I love to do live events, interact with people face to face, but also I've got a good mixture of online events where I create a Zoom meeting and then we broadcast it through YouTube or Facebook, and then people can see it. I can point to it. So it's really a good mixture.
What I have to commend you is the beginning of the pandemic, you were in the Career Pivot community, and we're all trying to learn how to best optimize Zoom and other online events. So we held a bunch of Wednesday night calls around how to do this. And I think that has served you very well.
Oh, definitely. I mean, I consider myself sort of professional now at it. Because one thing I learned, I remember one of the Wednesday night session was we learned that audio was the most important thing. Video was secondary, but was important. And that how to do lighting. And then there's always little technical things you can do around online meetings. But if you've got the lighting and the audio set up well, the event can go well. And I've now taught over 900 sessions that get set up on Zoom, and I really learned how to do it, and I'm comfortable with it. And that took some time, but now I'm really well versed in it.
The other Mark Miller came to me, I don't know, a month or two ago, looking for someone who was doing a solo gig in retirement. And I gave him 5 names. Russ was one of them. You just got featured in the New York Times.
I did, to my surprise, and thanks to Mark Miller. Both Mark Millers.
Yeah. So tell us about how that came off.
Well, you had introduced me to Mark about 3 years ago, I think.
Yep.
And I was on his podcast, and we've just kept in touch. And he contacted me after he talked to you, and I said I'd love to talk to him. And we had a good conversation, and that led to the article. He's excellent to work with. I think that there are a lot of factors that fit into what some of us are trying to do right now. And by the way, my book editor, I've had 2 book editors. In fact, 2 worked on this recent project. One of them is Susan Leahy, who I met through you, Mark, and I think one thing I can say is that there's a whole bunch of pieces to fit together in I call this post-career, which sounds funny to people, but when we start out in our 20s, we're going to have a career, we're going to have a family, we're going to have whatever. And that by the time we're in our 50s or 60s, we've maybe had those things. And the question is, well, I've got time left. What am I going to do? Well, Susan joked, she said, why is it you're not sitting in the beachfront somewhere with a little umbrella drink? And I said, it's because I'd rather be walking and writing about it. And I think that there's a whole bunch of pieces you have to put together in this kind of post-career phase. And one is, for me, the most important one is that you do what you love. I can do what I love as long as I live. I don't have to do stuff I don't want to do anymore. I don't have to work with, I don't have to force myself to work with people that I don't need to work with anymore. And I also want to try to make money at it. Because for many of us, Social Security will not provide enough. So it doesn't provide enough for me. So I just put together the fact that, and I also had this kind of, I don't know, I don't want to call it a fear, but a belief, somewhat ironic belief, which was that if you retire, you will die. And that's because starting in my 20s, I would meet people who hated their work and all they could do was wait to retire. And within 1 or 2 years of retiring, they died. And for me, I didn't have to wait that long. I knew a lot of people that loved their work and they kept doing it as long as they lived. And I said, well, that makes total sense. And then when I was in my early 50s, and I think I was 53, I was with my brother-in-law who at 56 died of lung cancer, never smoked. And he had a great sense of humor. He jokingly said to me, his retirement advisor had gotten in touch with him recently and wondered if he needed to take a look at his timeline for retirement. And he said, I think I need to look at that timeline. He actually lived another day. And the point is, we don't know how much time we have left. We don't know what could happen to us. And why are we waiting for some moment when we think we're going to arrive and have everything, and it may never arrive? So I figure if you work at what you love doing as long as you live, and you can make some extra money, you can make money at it on top of that. Life can be very satisfying at this point. And I am fortunate to be healthy. I like to walk and bike long distances, and there's no physical limitation to that other than the minor ones that might come at this age. I got a whole host of friends and relatives with a whole bunch of artificial joints right now. And I that's tough. And I feel for them. I'm fortunate to have all the original parts there, and I'm going to keep moving as long as I can.
So what is next?
Well, I'm currently promoting the current book. Also picking up clients for my book consulting and self-publishing business. This fall, I'm now launching into yet another tangential venture. And this is an important thing I would advise someone is if you can keep different little gigs tangentially connected to one another, it's the best. So I was asked to, I had been asked by various people if I would lead some tours in Europe, especially in particular walking tours. And I said, I think it's a good idea. I'd like to do that. I'm not sure how to do it. And then a friend named Sandy Brown, who runs Pilgrim Paths, asked me if I would host one of his tours in September for about 17 days. And I jumped at the chance. It would promote my book. It'll give me a chance to get my feet wet on doing some tour hosting. In Italy, you have to have a local certified guide actually lead a tour. So I'm sort of considered the tour host with the group. And so meanwhile, I'm planning on putting together my own trip, hopefully with Sandy for the spring, a different route over in Italy. Also, these are all on the way to St. Francis, where I just wrote my book about it. And I'd like to do others. And so adding touring into the mix of writing about this kind of thing and consulting along writing, these things all touch each other. And so I'm not going in a separate direction where my energy has to now, burn energy going somewhere else. They all touch. So people go on my tours, the tours and promote my book promotes the tours, book promotes my consulting business. So they all touch each other. And so I'm glad they're all things I love doing. And so I'm just planning on keeping going this as long as I live. The one thing about the tours in Europe, the hiking tours, is they are kind of limited to fall and spring because it gets pretty hot there in the summer. So I would actually like to lead bike tours in the US June and July every year. And I'm looking into doing that either with another company or start my own. I live near about an hour and a half to 2 hours from the premier biking trip in the U.S., which is to go between Washington, D.C. and Pittsburgh on bike on the Great Allegheny Passage, the C&O Towpath. And that is a subject of probably my next book.
Yeah, I remember you doing that in the middle of the pandemic, of writing it and going, okay, I can, because so many people live so close to that path. They don't live on it, but they live within an hour.
Within an hour or two are so many millions of people. And it is unbelievably remote. Once you head out, when you are 60 miles west of Washington in the Allegheny Mountains, you think you are in the middle of nowhere. So that's really nice. And I've lived near or biked on it for decades. And I also just have a way of kind of sopping up information, everything from geography to history. And so I love to share that with people. It's not just you're biking, on a path near a river, but there's history that happened here or some unusual geological feature and ongoing history. So I love sharing that, and I hope to be doing that as well. So again, continuing to travel, write about it, and also now adding on hosting tours for people.
Yeah. Again, out of curiosity, how did you get to know Sandy for the Italian tours?
Yes. When I was looking for endorsers for my first book, I just reached out to a whole bunch of people that I thought were experienced in walking the Camino de Santiago. And out of the blue, I just emailed Sandy. He responded back. He'd love to review it. He reviewed it, loved it, gave me a good review. Then he actually asked me if I'd be interested in writing guidebooks. He's a guidebook editor. And I thought about it, and I realized what it entailed. It's a pretty big ongoing commitment to write a guidebook about a particular place. And I thought that would have been a good career 30 or 40 years ago. So I decided instead to continue the kind of writing I'm doing. But I've continued to be friends with Sandy, tapped him for information for my current book, my most recent book. And he moved to Italy. He actually moved to Lucca, Italy. And another friend, Lee Brennan, who moved to Santiago. They're both people that, in the 50s, 60s, kind of took their dream to another country. I'll gladly and happily go over there and hike and walk, but I'm going to stay based where I am.
The reason why I bring that up is I wrote in my newsletter this last week about my relationship with the other Mark Miller from Retirement Revised. And that started out with me reaching out, and Richard Eisenberg from Next Avenue introduced me to Mark after I asked for an introduction. Mark had written a book called Jolt. Nothing came of that, but then he came back to me the following year looking for somebody, and I gave him Cleo Parker's name, who had her plan was to work until whenever. That was her retirement plan, and that didn't turn out. So she got a full write-up in the New York Times, which turned out to be very beneficial to her. I've been on Mark's podcast. He's been on my podcast 3 times. And then when he came looking for people, I gave him literally 5 people, including my own name, about doing this solo gig in retirement. And this is a 6-year relationship. It doesn't happen overnight. It's a mutual beneficial relationship. And my goal is to help him no matter what. And he was real surprised when he looked for a name and I gave him 5.
Well, you used an important term, mutually beneficial. I always look at relationships. The important ones are mutually beneficial and cooperative, and that people don't ever feel used. That's why I'm always eager to give away stuff to people, give away help, give away connections, because people have helped me out. But it's mutually beneficial, and I keep track of those, like with you, with other people I've gotten to know over the years, because at one point in our life, perhaps we have connections through our job, we have connections through where we live. Those are all important. But when we get older, we begin to need connections through this point, this phase of life. And a lot of people around me, I mean, I have lots of friends in my age group who are happily retired, wanting to do nothing, but take things easy, and that's fine. I don't have no criticism of them. I'm not there. Probably never will quite be. So I need to find people who are kind of actively looking for things to do or work at this phase in life. Anyway, sometimes you have to cast that net wider.
Well, and you have to be willing to give. And when you give, you expect nothing in return.
Right.
But the reality is, if you go back to my episode I did a couple of weeks ago with Steve Harper, and the ripple effect is, as you do good things for others, it creates ripples that come back.
That's right.
You just don't know when they come back.
Exactly.
Russ, this has been great. I love hearing your story. In this case, we're doing this over Zoom, so I get to see your smiling face. If someone wanted to reach out and contact you, and of course, buy both of your books, because you don't want to just set them to buy one, how do they do that?
At russeanes.com. That's where my books are. You can also contact me through that. I get multiple contacts every day, which I love, and really eager to help people. In fact, I'm going to have a call this afternoon with somebody that reached out who's just kind of in this phase of life and is trying to figure a few things out. I said, give me, if you want to have a talk, I can have a talk with you. So yeah, that's how you can get a hold of me.
And I'll put a link to his website in the show notes. So, Russ, thank you very much for being on the Repurpose Your Career podcast.
Thank you, Mark, for having me. Great to be back here again.
I hope Russ's story has inspired you. I was quoted in the New York Times article. Let me read you a paragraph from the article. Experts caution that a transition from full-time work to entrepreneurship not only takes longer than you might expect, but also comes with twists and turns. Quote, and where you end up will be different than you expect, unquote, says Mark Miller, who is the founder of Career Pivot, coaches older workers on career transitions. Quote, if you are adaptable and resilient, you will often end up in a better but different place than you planned. Close quote. Russ has proven to be both adaptable and resilient, and where he ended up is not where he planned. Take a moment, go to careerpivot.com, sign up for the weekly Career Pivot Insights newsletter, which is sent out every Sunday. You'll get a weekly update on this podcast, white papers, and new blog posts. When you subscribe, you'll receive my latest white paper, Ageism, the Last Acceptable Bias. While there, do not forget to check out the Career Pivot community, which can be found at careerpivot.com/community. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. Look for Career Pivot on LinkedIn. Thank you for listening all the way to the end of the Repurpose Your Career podcast. You will find all the show notes at careerpivot.com/episode-322. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Podbeam, Overcast, Spotify, Pandora, Amazon Music, and lots of other places where podcasts can be found. In fact, this podcast can be found on the Repurpose Your Career podcast channel on YouTube. Hope to see you next Monday for another episode of Repurpose Your Career podcast.